It was a Deweyite progressive school, which was very successful. Maybe for me, at least, was perfect. It was not unstructured, but it did emphasize initiative, creativity, working with others. There was no grading. You were encouraged to pursue your own interests, but within a structure that was established. So you did learn the things you had to learn, but meanwhile pursuing your own interests and often working with others. In fact, I wasn't even aware that I was a good student until I went to high school. I went from this relatively free, creative, exciting environment to a pretty regimented academic high school where everyone is ranked and you do exactly what you're supposed to do and everyone's trying to get into college and so on. And then I discovered I was a good student. I mean, I knew I had skipped a grade and everyone else knew I'd skipped a grade, but nobody else. The only thing anyone noticed was I was the smallest kid in the class, but it didn't mean anything aside from that. And I can remember the school years very well. I barely remember high school. It's kind of like a black hole.
And do you think competition is counter-stimulating?
It shouldn't be there. What's the point of being better than someone else?
And where was this school?
Right outside the city limits of Philadelphia. It was in a kind of an open countryside. So by the time I was old enough to, my best friend and I would spend Saturday riding our bikes all over the countryside.
Did you keep friends from this age or during your life?
We sort of separated by high school. We all went our separate ways.
You spent a lot of time on your own.
With my father, by the time I was 10 or 11 or so, every Friday night, for example, we would read Hebrew classics, 19th century literature, essays. It was just part of the routine of incorporating the emerging, reviving Hebrew culture that was all of their lives. I mean, that's what they were devoted to, the revival of the language, the culture, the Palestinian community, this Hebraic revival.
Did you say Palestinian community?
Well, it's pre-Israel, so it's a Jewish community in Palestine.
Okay.
Yeah. I suppose by now my father would be called an anti-Zionist. He was then a deeply committed Zionist. But for him it was a cultural revival, basically. Not particularly interested in the Jewish state.
Do you remember if you had an ambition for your future as a child?
A lot of crazy ambitions. I remember once telling my mother that I had decided that when I grew up, I wanted to be a taxidermist. Don't ask me why. I guess I liked the word. I was about 8 years old.
So, since I'm ignorant, I got the luck to discover Descartes. I mean, I knew who Descartes was, but I read him after I read you. And I noticed he gives you the tools to doubt what he's saying. It's like the opposite of dogmatism.
I mean, that ought to be the ideal of teaching anyway, whether it's children or graduate students. They should be taught to challenge and to question images that come from the Enlightenment about this that say that teaching should not be like pouring water into a vessel. It should be like laying out a string along which the student travels in his or her own way, and maybe even questioning whether the string's in the right place. And, after all, that's how modern science started. For thousands of years, it was accepted by scientists that objects move to their natural place. So a ball goes to the ground and steam goes to the sky. These things are kind of like common sense, and they were taken for granted for literally thousands of years from Aristotle. And it wasn't until Galileo and the modern scientific revolution that scientists decided to be puzzled by these obvious things. And as soon as you start to question things, you see nothing like that makes any sense. And every stage of science, or even just learning, serious learning, comes from asking, why do things work like that? Why not some other way? All right, you find that the world is a very puzzling place. And if you're willing to be puzzled, you can learn. If you're not willing to be puzzled and just copy down what you're told or behave the way you're taught, you just become a replica of someone else's mind. I mean, some of the technical work I'm doing now is initiated by my suddenly realizing that assumptions that have been standard throughout modern history of generative grammar, but in fact throughout the traditional study of language, just have no basis. And when we ask, okay, then why do we assume them? You have to look for a basis. Then lots of avenues open up. And that happens constantly.
And do you remember when you start to build your own voice or your own philosophy in a way? And could you describe how this process happened?
It's a constant process. And it probably starts with my not wanting to eat my oatmeal. Why, And in any kind of scientific inquiry, any kind of rational inquiry, it's striking in science, you have a conception of how things ought to work. If you look at the empirical data, they're usually at least partially recalcitrant. Things don't fall into place. So you typically are working with a conflict between a conception of the way things ought to work in terms of elegance, simplicity, naturalness, and a look at the messy way in which things do seem to work. The Galilean revolution, which was a real revolution in the way of looking at the world, for one thing, because of the willingness to be puzzled about what seemed to be simple things. It's a hard move to make. In the case I mentioned, it was 2,000 years, smart people.
Yeah.
They said that nature is simple, and it's the task of the scientist to show that it's simple. And if we've not been able to do that, we've failed as scientists. So if you find irreducible complexity, you just haven't understood. Well, that's a pretty good guideline. And it does turn out to be a very effective driving element in inquiry. Because there's good reasons why I think it ought to turn out to be simple. I mean, for Galileo and the whole of early modern science, right through Newton, great scientists, Huygens, others, Bernoulli, through Newton. It's just a kind of classic period of modern science. There was a very clear concept of intelligibility. The goal of science was to show that the world is intelligible. And intelligible meant something. It meant something that an artisan could create. Gears and levers and something like a model was these, say, medieval clocks, which did all sorts of amazing things. That goes right through Newton. It's called the mechanical philosophy. Philosophy just meant science. So it's mechanical science, and that's the goal. I mean, Galileo at the end of his life was kind of distraught because he was not able to construct mechanical models of the tides and the motion of the planets and so on. So he felt his scientific life had failed. But then it went on. Finally you get to Newton, and Newton demonstrated, to his dismay, that the world doesn't work like a machine, that there are what his scientific colleagues called occult forces, namely attraction and repulsion, which don't operate by contact. So you can attract things at a distance, which was just unintelligible. Newton himself thought that this was what he called an absurdity, which no person with any scientific understanding could ever believe. There are just inherent mysteries which are beyond our cognitive capacities. Well, that was correct, and that was a real shocking discovery. It has now been absorbed. So to talk about the current stage is misleading if you're thinking about emerging fields like cognitive science, because we're not in that stage. We haven't got to the Galilean stage yet.